This is the Work Smart Hypnosis Podcast, session number 314. Richard Clark on building community.
Welcome to the Work Smart Hypnosis Podcast with Jason Linett, your professional resource for hypnosis training and outstanding business success. Here's your host, Jason Linett.
This is about to get interesting because for the majority of you out there, you've likely already heard of the HypnoThoughts Live convention. This is the biggest hypnosis conference in the entire world. It's coming up in July and August 2021 in Las Vegas. And knowing of the event, you might know of Richard Clark, who is 1/3 of the team that puts on that event, him along with Scott Sandland and Stephanie Skiba. For those of you that all of this is new to, well, first of all, let me call one thing out proudly. This is the first time we got Richard Clark to do a podcast. Hold for applause. And welcome back. And I'm so happy that he's here on this program because it helps us to see a little bit more of the story behind who he is, what drives his thinking, and really the impact that, quite honestly, he's helped to create in this entire industry. You're about to hear a conversation that really begins in terms of work in a very different profession, but then how that kind of led its way into getting trained as a marriage and family therapist. And then along that journey, also getting into organizational psychology. And this is about to sound familiar, how it is that we can start to organize groups and get people working together to create a bigger impact inside of their organizations. Once again, 1/3 of the team behind HypnoThoughts Live. Though inside of this too, some of the work that he's done as a marriage and family therapist, and then from there, a bit of a chance encounter, first, let's say officially learning hypnosis, being represented as hypnosis, and a real turning point where here was a local sort of get-together that was being organized in various parts of California, sort of a branded meetup group that Richard reached out to the organizers to say, can we do one of these in my area? And the response, as you're about to hear the story, not to give too much away too early, was, hey, we've already had a few others reach out. Why don't you do it with them? And becoming the first time that suddenly here's the first meeting with some names that you might recognize, where organizing for the first time together, there's Richard Clark, there's Richard Rumble, there's Scott Sandland, and there's David Snyder. The rest of the story now starts to write itself. You're going to hear some of the work that he currently does as someone who is actively working in mental health, whether it's in the therapy world, whether it's in the hypnosis world, or as he puts it, strategic therapy, how it is we start to mesh all these things together. Plus, you're going to hear some really cool insights behind what really makes HypnoThoughts Live really tick. And sort of the global impact of, yes, here we are in the midst of a global pandemic, but also in a bit of a evolution, and let's also use the HypnoThoughts branding of revolution, of how so much of what we do can now reach a global audience. The world has become a whole lot smaller, and how very often we end up together at an event in another part of the world with people that we already know. And HypnoThoughts has really given us an outlet to make that happen. I have to set up one story that pops up a little bit later on, which I forget if Scott and I got into this in a podcast recording, or maybe it was in one of the videos for HypnoThoughts Platinum. But the fact that when we first were introduced to each other, let's phrase it that way, we did not get along. And the story very clearly changed over the years of giving the keynote at HypnoThoughts, giving the opportunity to do HypnoThoughts Platinum back in February of 2020, before everything got weird. But the opportunity that really, this is a big legacy of what HypnoThoughts stands for. The fact that we get to actually interact with these people. I'd rewind my personal story briefly back a moment, where here I was at the very first, let's not even say convention, the first gathering of hypnotists that I'd gone to. And there was going to be someone who was going to be there that I had read their book, I had heard about them, I had seen some video clips of, and I'd really put this person up on a pedestal. And then to finally meet, it wasn't that it was a letdown. No, everything that I was expecting was there and even better. But the fact that we were all human, and these were folks that were approachable. And if you look at, really, I'd say what the legacy of HypnoThoughts has helped to really reinforce, the folks who keep it to themselves and, create a mindset of scarcity, or dare I even say absolutism, which I've recently talked about here on this podcast series, that doesn't tend to have longevity these days. The environment where we're all in this together, learning and growing and benefiting from each other. And yes, as where my story with Scott originally began, the appropriate moment to get a friendly smack in the face to go, not literally, hey, this is how we all can do this better and growing over time too, and creating those collaborative relationships. So we're going to link to this, I know, in the show notes over at worksmarthypnosis.com. Head over to htlive.net. That's where you can see the incredible lineup, workshops that are happening before, during, and after the convention. And of course, let me mention Hypnotic Products. This is the 2-day business training that I am doing right after the conference. So come for the event, stick around afterwards, because so many people in this industry are thinking way too small. I mean, look at the story of HypnoThoughts of finding a way to reach a global audience. And with Hypnotic Products, it's all about helping practitioners around the world to break out of the dependency upon a dollars for hours model. And while this is a workshop about business and earning a better income, it's not just a workshop about business and earning a better income. It's really about showing you the systems to create an even greater impact in this world that's around you. And think about this for a moment. What if you could change the dynamic so that your clients are people who have already interacted with you, have already benefited from you, have already created a change as a result of something they've accomplished with you by way of an online training, a product, or whatever template you want to use. And now imagine the changes that are going to be different in your business where your clients are people who are willing to follow instructions, completely ready to work with you, and willing to pay the fees that you ask. I'll tell you right now, that's what I've done in recent years, and that's why I've closed down the thing that built my business originally. At the time of release of this, I'm already down in Florida, and the Virginia Hypnosis office is no longer the Virginia Hypnosis office. The business has gone global thanks to the brand we've built over at jasonlinett.com. So think about this. What if you could take what you do, and here's the catchphrase you're going to come to learn, productize a service to think even bigger? That's what you're going to get at Hypnotic Products. Make sure you go to that hypnoticproducts.com page, though, because you'll see it's not just a 2-day event. It's also ongoing training afterwards, plus some private consulting time with me. Check that out, hypnoticproducts.com. Though I'd also mention jasonwebinar.com. This is an on-demand webinar presentation teaching you 6 verifiable things you can do every month to continue to grow your business. It's absolutely free and on-demand, jasonwebinar.com. Though let's get to this episode number 314. Let me call it out. I've pestered him a few times. He finally said yes, and this conversation delivers to hear more of the story behind the person who many of us know and the real heart behind the work. And again, this community aspect, which is why we named the episode as we did. Here we go. Episode number 314, Richard Clark on building community.
Well, I had worked for years. I had 2 previous occupations before. When I was in high school, I got a job as a dishwasher, and my talent at making the dishes nice and clean and efficiently was noticed. And I was taken under the wing of a chef at a French restaurant. So I was an apprentice chef and worked in the restaurant industry until I was 20. And then after that, I had taken a job working in a machine shop. I got into a journeyman program to be a machinist, and followed that through. I became a tool maker, a model maker, and then all without any education started getting jobs in production engineering. And so I'd worked a long time in the production field, but I had no degree. So I started going to college when I was 29. At that time, that was, this is in 1989, 1990. There was a big push. The Japanese were seen to be taking over, production and sales in the U.S. So there was a big push on total quality management. And I joined some total quality management teams and took some trainings, which got me interested really in like organizational psychology.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to college as a business major, and I got more and more interested in the psychology of people, and I switched in my junior year to be a psych major. And being basically a lazy person, I thought, oh, geez, back then, I can charge $100 an hour and just like work 15, 20 hours a week. And this sounds like the dream job. So that's what I did. And I followed that through and then went on to graduate school. But that got me interested in mental health. And then, interestingly enough, for my first training, I learned hypnosis online. right? And this is back in the 90s when
Yeah.
learning hypnosis online was not a thing, right? And I don't know, I assume you probably remember, I mean, you're a little younger than I am, but in the late 90s, Yahoo groups were,
Yes.
were the big thing, and AOL groups back then, right?
I think as of like 2 months ago, the last Yahoo group I was still a member of, the emails finally stopped.
I still get some. I still get some.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was interested. This is when I was in graduate school, right, for psychology, and I was interested in it some, and had learned some sort of in graduate school. Was learning some about Milton Erickson, anyways, and so I started looking online. I found these Yahoo groups. And so I joined some of those. And so my first, the first people that taught me inductions were actually online, right?
Mhm.
And so for a few years I did that. And then at one point, I don't know, 99, 2000, I remember I took my first hypnosis training was a 2.5 day weekend training by the ABH, by Matt James, actually, right?
Oh, nice.
You went in on a Friday evening, and they warmed you up, and then they gave you a script for induction, and you practiced that, and then they sold you on their longer programs, right? Showed you some fancy inductions and fancy work, and that was it. So that was my first hypnosis training.
Yeah, I want to go back for a moment because
Yeah,
you mentioned organizational psychology. Was that the header?
yeah.
Yeah. So where was that originally going to be going? What was the focus of going in that direction?
More in human resource management, right? So like I say, back at that time, I there was this big drive on building teamwork and changing up the work environment, more ergonomics in the work environment, and focusing more on making the employees comfortable and compensating them and giving them more autonomy in order to boost production. So that was really, I worked for some big companies. I had some big jobs for some, Fortune 100 companies in production. And they had like I worked for one of the oldest bottle companies in the world, right? It was Crown Cork and Seal, and they were based out of Philadelphia. And they started off making corks, right, back in the 1800s, and their whole production mentality was to really work people to death on antiquated machines that were held together with duct tape, uh, and it
Which
was.
right away sounds like a group that could use some, mental health benefit. Yes.
Well, and the reason I went full fledged, so I had a big job actually. I made back then was great money. I was making six figures as an undegreed engineer, right? And actually, I was working as a plant superintendent, and they wanted me to sign off on something that was really unethical, right?
Yeah.
And I basically said, no, I can't do this, right? Because I'd been working really hard. I'd been brought in to revitalize I was actually recruited from another company to revitalize the workforce, right? And implement total quality management principles. And it was just a really unethical thing. And I said, no, I can't do that. And they said, well, maybe you can't work here. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. So at that time, I had just gone through a breakup with, a person I was living with, and moved out and switched my major at college. And actually, I was basically homeless for a year, right? I went from making, like I said, over $100,000 salary to being basically homeless. I worked a job in a sober living home where 5 nights a week I did the overnight shift, right? So I put everyone to bed, slept on a little bed that was in the office, and then woke them up in the morning. And then on the weekends, I just fended for myself, slept with friends or hotels or whatever. But that I forget what the hell was the question.
No, I love that in terms of, again, looking at, well, that kind of opens up a whole conversation, their possibility of, how it is that we can look at, there's so many opportunities that are out there, that this is a big conversation that often pops up in terms of, I've done presentations on hypnotic language patterns for HR delegates. and to hear how so much of it isn't just, oh, this is the insurance we provide. Oh, here's when you have to get the timesheet in.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
really their role is that of creating that dynamic and having everyone. This is what I did in theater. How do we get everyone to work together and not hate each other? So from the inside out and seeing the opportunities from there. So you mentioned going from that into then finding this hypnosis training. Was there something about the hypnosis that attracted you or something that piqued your curiosity? How would you kind of motivate that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, most everyone, I guess, I would say the majority of people, find hypnosis to be sort of a fascinating thing when they're a kid and they read about it or see it in movies. It's, oh, mind control. It sounds like an interesting, like, oh, what's that about? So, I mean, I was interested in it. And then, once you put your toe in a little and find out what it's really about, then it's like, oh, this is cool. I can definitely do this. And you talk about language patterning, etc. People, I always get a kick when people say, "Oh, Bill Clinton and Obama must have had NLP training," and no, they didn't have any NLP training. These are just natural skills that people have that NLP is modeled.
Thank you. You're talking my language. No, you're right. It's
I
where
found that.
well, any cycle, it's always the game of, and both sides too. This person was using this. It's like, well, this is all modeled after effective communication. And if we define communication as being effective because it elicited a response, you can always after the fact go, oh, that's like this technique. And the keyword is like this
Yeah.
technique. Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, and I found, I found out, geez, I'm a pretty persuasive person, anyways. I build rapport pretty well, anyways. So I mean, I sort of found myself to be a natural and just dove into it more from there. And then my next step, after having taken a 2.5 day training, was one of the Yahoo groups, or a couple of the Yahoo groups, were for the somnambulistic sleepwalkers. I don't know if you recall that back
Yeah,
in
I've heard stories. Yeah.
yeah, and so there was a chapter that was started by John Petrocelli in New York, and then Craig Eubanks had one in San Francisco, and oh, what was the Perry? I can't remember his last name, in San Diego. So I contacted John in New York. I had been interacting on their Yahoo groups and chats and whatnot. Some contacted him and said, "Hey, I'd like to open up a Los Angeles chapter." He said, "Great. I just someone else had just contacted me. Why don't you get in contact with him and you guys can do this together?" And that was David Snyder.
Yep.
So David Snyder and I started a Yahoo group for the Los Angeles chapter of the Somnambulistic Sleepwalkers, and set our first meeting where Scott Sandlin and Richard Rumble attended. And then for the next like 4 years, we met every Tuesday. So this is where I really got my hypnosis education, right? For every Tuesday evening for 4 years, we got together with sometimes only a dozen people, sometimes 40, right? And had practice sessions, and we would have a speaker, and we had Cal Banyan speak, Tom Silver, Justin Trance. We had a meeting at the ACHE convention with Gil Boyne. So I mean, these were people that really knew their stuff, right? And every one of us had something to add. And so that's where I got the majority of my training, was 4 years of every Tuesday night.
Yeah, which correct me, at that time too, you were also operating as a marriage and family therapist as well, yes?
Yes, we when we started, I was still in graduate school, right? And I also I would point this out a lot, when we were at the meetings and talking to everyone. I learned a lot of hypnosis in graduate school as for a master's in counseling psychology, although they don't call it hypnosis. I mean, I
Mhm.
studied a semester of Virginia Satir and a semester of Fritz Perls and a semester of Jay Haley, right? And many others. And, they rarely would talk about it as being hypnosis. Occasionally, I mean, if are familiar with Jay Haley, he's a student of Erickson's. He talked all about Erickson's conversational hypnosis style, and sort of broke it down for therapists. So yeah, I was operating as an intern during that time, a marriage and family therapist intern, and so it brought a lot both ways. I could bring a lot from my experiences working with clients, and sort of a more mainstream view of hypnotic interventions, and then also bring the trainings I was learning at our Tuesday night meetings into work.
So then, from our conversation, from the dialogue that any of us would have nowadays, yes, we know that hypnosis is not just the close your eyes and now you're going to follow my instructions, how so much of it around the influence, the framing, and setting it up. I was curious to ask you, was there ever a time making use of that working, let's say, family therapy with a couple?
I'm trying to think. I don't know. I've worked with tens of thousands of clients now. I've been doing this for a long time, and I can't think of any time with a couple. I can remember doing some group hypnosis sessions. I've done a lot of individual hypnosis sessions, obviously, but more often than not, I don't call what I'm doing with a client hypnosis. It may be, yeah, okay, let's try something here, and
Right.
I just want you to close your eyes and take in a deep breath and proceed from there, right? But
I'm
sometimes,
trying to remember who it was, the line a couple of episodes ago. Okay, well, this isn't hypnosis, but close your eyes and now relax your eyelids to the point where they just won't work. I'm like, wait, what?
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, occasionally there's clients. I mean, every client is different, and the interventions are always different. I refer to myself to everyone as a strategic therapist, which is
I
Jay
like that.
Haley, Jay Haley's terminology for doing hypnosis, conversational hypnosis in a mental health setting is strategic therapy. So every client's different, and there's some where I sort of recognized, okay, we're going to do some hypnosis. This is going to work great for you. So,
Mhm.
occasionally that comes out, but most often it's not. Most often it's, like I said, just a matter of, planning a little pattern, a reframe, a few suggestions here and there, and working it more covertly and conversationally.
Now, there's a story that I've heard by legend that I have to ask you about here, which would be, and I heard this from Scott, that a strategy at one point, and it may have just been a one off experience of working with a couple and basically switching out the file so you could look inept and this would get them to now finally work together. Do I have that correct?
I did something switching out the file. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I pulled up when a couple came in, and I pulled up and started talking about issues that weren't theirs, right? So, I mean, I've never been one to rely a lot on the file, but yeah, get them both working against me, and I really, I said, no, weren't we talking about, and I, looking through, notes, and, weren't we talking about how just make up a name, how John had done this last week and everything? No, no, what, so yeah, I mean, a lot of, I mean, I did a lot of reading back then too, and a lot of things that I guess interventions you could attribute to someone doing Ericksonian hypnosis, right? Or were the kinds of things that I use often, and
Hmm.
continue to use often. A lot of it is it's not really from Erickson, but also I know you're familiar with solution focused therapy. I use
Hmm.
a lot of interventions from solution focused therapy, and there are really good ways to view your interventions. Look for exception finding and magical thinking and things like that to really nail down your reframes or your sleight of mouth patterns.
Yeah, which I know we're going to come around to hypnothoughts here in a few moments, but it's where most of us would know of you from the conference. Yet you're still someone who's out there actively working with people. Is there a specific specialty that you tend to work with more so nowadays?
Well, no, currently, right now, actually, I'm working on the BetterHelp.com network, right,
Yeah.
and seeing clients there because it's easy. I actually had a little while after, let's see, when, let's see, in like 2015, really, it was like right when we started the Newport clinic that you're familiar with. Scott
Hmm.
and I had moved into an office together and opened a clinic, that I sort of stopped seeing clients, right, for a while. I was managing the clinic and had sort of, I had 20 years of day to day. And, some of my work experience I know you've heard of. I know others may not have, but I worked for, 7 years in a community mental health clinic in South Central Los Angeles, where, I would see sometimes, 60 clients a week, right? I mean, there were so many clients lined up that, I would see one for, 35, 40 minutes and dismiss them, and there's someone else standing right outside the door, and it was just a revolving door. So, I'd seen a lot of clients on a lot of, difficult issues, and I sort of felt like, okay, let me just take more of an administrative role. And I just actually, it was during the start of the pandemic, right? I decided, okay, I'm going to start seeing clients online. And I had some old clients that I continued to see sort of sporadically, through Zoom or Skype before that. And then I found the betterhelp.com, and it just really streamlines everything. They find all the clients, they have the whole platform, and do most all, well, do actually all the file keeping and everything. So all I have to do is set up a calendar and click on go to session, and it's very much a set it and forget it.
Nice, nice, nice. So then back to it was the Sleepwalkers group, and inside of that, I love the origin story of there's you, there's David Snyder, there's Scott Sandlin, there's Richard Rumble, a lot of the people who we now know as a big part of the HypnoThoughts live community. Where inside of this, because Scott had launched hypnothoughts.com, somewhere back in that time frame. At what point in that journey can we say that you started to, come on a board and it become now the movement of this big live in-person event?
Oh, well, so back, we did some things with the Sleepwalkers. We put on like the first, National Hypnosis Day, January 4th. What do they call it?
World Hip,
Wor-
Tom Nicola Eve, but also World Hypnotism Day.
well, actually, the first year, I don't know if you've heard this story. I think you probably have. Wendy Friesen was big back then.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, she was competing against the NGH or whatever. And so at the same time, really, I don't know who was first. I don't care who was first, but she started a Hypnotize America Day, the same day as World Hypnosis Day.
Mm-hmm.
So they were going together. So, but we had known Wendy because she had come, participated in our Tuesday night meetings sometimes. So we put on open to the public. We had 16 1-hour talks, 2 rooms going, and
Oh, now
and
this sounds familiar.
and a vendor room.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the first World Hypnosis Day. We rented out 3 rooms at a Holiday Inn in Long Beach. If anyone's ever flown into Long Beach, it's the one that looks like a Capitol Records building right next to the airport. So we had done that, and that's where I sort of showed my original talents in organizing. And then Scott and David and Richard and I and a few other people actually set up a hypnotherapy practice, right? We all had separate offices, but we had one website called California Hypnotherapy, oddly enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, we split referrals back and forth and cross referred. But we also then decided to start doing some training. So I actually, set up and organized David Snyder's first training ever in conversational persuasion and influence. And then also Scott Sandlin's first in-person training for, these were both weekend trainings, 2-day trainings, Saturday, Sunday. And his was in pain management. And then later on, we did a training with Richard Rumble at the Magic Castle, actually. But this is where we got started sort of collaborating on events, right?
Yeah.
And then actually, the Sleepwalkers thing, we'd kind of abandoned it. There was a part in there for a while where we started, myself, John Petrocelli, and Mark Cunningham started a hypnosis organization called the Society of Applied Hypnosis. And we ran with that for about a year, and it didn't really work out the way we had hoped. But that's sort of at that time. Then there was some bad feelings back and forth, and the Sleepwalkers Association sort of fizzled out.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a couple of years without doing the Sleepwalkers meetings and without really close contact. I mean, I'd see Scott, every 3 months, and talk to him on the phone some here and there. When Scott started up hypnothoughts.com, he said he wanted to, start up a new thing, and he had a couple of shots at it before something really took off. And
Mhm.
at the
I
beginning,
want to I want to go back to a word that you used a moment ago about fizzled out, which the joke is now, oh, in the modern marketing world, that's now called a pivot.
yeah,
That, oh yeah, as well, you could look at what I do and say, well, yeah, Jason runs that failed meetup group in Northern Virginia. I'm like, well, no, it pivoted into the Work Smart Hypnosis podcast, which, hey, welcome, you're listening now. Of looking at how we can find a different way of going about something rather than just one specific way of doing it. So, good job with the pivot there.
so when he started that, he asked me to help moderate it, and that grew a lot. And then, I mean, I know you and probably many of your listeners have heard the story from Scott before about how HypnoThoughts Live got started. Is a bunch of people wanted to wear HypnoThoughts buttons to the NGH convention, and they didn't want that to happen, so we decided to have our own convention. See how nicely I said that?
Well, I mean, looking at when we find there's an audience that's already there.
Yeah.
Here was everyone who wanted to have an outlet that we were all interacting. I think that year, unofficially, Michael Elner, myself, and I think Seth Deberoth and a few others were like, we're going to call this the unofficial table as we're all at the banquet. But when we find that there's a community that wants to gather, so the natural pivot was to do something out in Vegas. I was curious to ask you because what year is this coming up on in
This is
terms of
going to be our ninth year.
yeah, because I remember the first year was when I was primarily a stage hypnotist and I had events booked. And my one regret that I can live with was not being there the first year, but there since. From this background of organizational psychology to then running the local meetup group, which then flourished over the years and that's right, pivoted into something else. I was curious to see what kind of trends have you been noticing, in terms of looking at this as an industry, in terms of how we learn, how we communicate about the process, how it is that, clearly the thing that, if we want to label a method here, which is not even a method we can, fake out, but to say clearly what's winning now is community. What would you say is that sort of greater impact that you've been noticing in this profession?
Well, I think it is technology. I mean, I think it's worked everywhere in our lives, and worked to good ends and less good ends. But the internet has made everyone closer, made it a smaller world. So where when I first got started, like I said, it was hard to find hypnotists. I mean, there weren't. I lived in Los Angeles, and I had a hard time finding hypnotists. The first meeting we had of the sleepwalkers, I sent out like 100 emails to anyone within driving distance of where we were going to meet that I could find that had hypnosis connected to them in any way, right? But people didn't really have meetups or get-togethers, and there wasn't online forums. So I think that's really what has changed a lot about the industry, or the profession of hypnotherapy, is that more and more people can connect with more people that are like-minded and interested in the same thing and facing the same challenges. So, and then that's really what HypnoThoughts was always about, was building community. And, it's funny, HypnoThoughts, it's an interesting thing. Scott and I and Stephanie all run HypnoThoughts. And people think it's like, I don't know, we're getting ready to go public and we've got a huge staff, and I mean, it's really, we're just organizing a family picnic is the way we look at it. I mean,
Nice. Well, you do feed everybody, so I guess that does line up.
yeah, it's just everyone, that's how it started, is okay, let's all get together in Las Vegas and let's have some people talk. And everyone loved it. And so it's grown into where now, it is a big thing, but it's really, it was never meant to compete with organizations. It was never meant to, be a big business, a money maker. That's why we try to keep everything, our prices low and provide as much as we can, because we're not looking to make money on it. We're just looking to collect enough money from everyone to make it happen. That's all. At the end of the day, we're hoping to have our bank account close to zero, right? I mean, spend the money we take in. and that's what we have been doing. So
Well, I think what's great about it too is it's become this opportunity for, yes, we can go and see a lot of the people that we already know and people that we've already interacted with. Yet what's become great about it is it's also that sort of foundation for a lot of people to then become known. I think it was Scott who said, not just to have a voice in the industry, but to, be recognized as one.
yeah,
That, when we find the environment where I'm trying to remember Scott's reference to this, but times where I've been sitting in a workshop, I'm like, oh, I'm sitting between Victoria Gallagher and Freddie Jacquin, and behind me is Richard Barker. And we're all at this workshop because we actually want to listen.
yeah.
That it's not the let's go to be seen, it's everybody's there on the same level. And I can't think of any other environment where that's just the natural foundation of it.
Yeah, and it's great, and a lot. I mean, I take a lot of personal pride in a lot of the connections that have been made in the community. I was thinking, I don't know, a few weeks back when I saw an advertisement you had for your trainings with Richard Nongard. You and Richard Nongard are people that might not have ever really crossed paths for a long time before HypnoThoughts.
Yeah, a few interactions just online, but then it was we're all here together, and just to have that opportunity to actually meet and interact.
And I don't know if I've ever told you this or told much of anyone this, so this will be great. But, I heard Scott posted a video the other day about how, well, HypnoThoughts, help provide some space for Jason and whatever. And you posted a video about first knowing Scott. Did you know that I had to drag Scott into your, it wasn't Work Smart. What was your original product?
Oh, yeah, okay. So when it's now, and I'll make the story brief. The program was originally Hypnosis Business Boot Camp, which, let me
Yeah.
call it out, even though I still own the trademark, was a crappy name. But I also saw that people were successful from what they learned from it, but the program needed a rebuild. It was originally linear. Now it's Hypnotic Business Systems, where every module stands on its own. But I remember, yeah, I think, Richard, you were in the first, I launched it off of a webinar around the holidays, I think in 2013, the original one. And there's my little moment of going, Richard Clark just got it. Huh.
Well, so the reason I got it right is because Scott was like, who's this Jason Lynette guy over there? And he was not necessarily that happy with you. And I said, well, let's look into it. And I bought it mostly for, I listened to a lot of stuff or watched, I think they were videos, weren't they? Watched a lot of them.
Yeah.
And gave them to Scott and said, look, I want you to watch this. And he was at first livid with the idea that you said something about cook and chef, and he was determined that we're stealing his cook and chef metaphor, and that he was really unhappy with. So it took a while for me to say, Scott, look, reach out to the guy, talk to him. He seems like a decent guy, and he's at that time, we were seen as a major competition by the NGH, right? And I never thought of them as competition, but I always like being a thorn in someone's side. And you were like the new hot child for the NGH at the time. And so, I told Scott, well, reach out to him. He seems like a decent guy, and it'll just piss the NGH off like you wouldn't believe, if he decides to come out to our conference or become more involved with us.
And I think that's about the time I started to publicly say, the more we're all successful, the more we're all successful.
Yeah.
No,
So
the short
really,
version of it was I had misquoted something, and I did not give credit where it was due, and as much as that was a section of giving a lot of credit. And, so this is, I think Scott and I shared the story. I forget if we told the entire thing on a podcast episode, or it might have been in some of the promo leading up to HypnoThoughts Platinum back last year. Our first interaction was the "Who the hell are you?" which the sort of button on the story was I Priority Express mailed him a doll of the Swedish chef from the Muppets to go, it's your quote and it's really good. Thank you. I'm sorry. Can we be friends? And we are.
Yeah. Well, I had put some work in before that.
I thank you for that. Yeah.
Get him receptive for that.
So I was curious to ask, so we find ourselves, live conferences took a bit of a hit in the last year as, suddenly here comes quarantines, here comes a pandemic, and we're seeing some numbers, let's say, look a little bit more positive moving forward. What is it we can look forward to in terms of HypnoThoughts coming up this year in July and August?
Well, I think it's going to be, an epic year. People use that word a lot, but I really think I mean, last year we had a good year, but there was only, where we're used to, roughly 1,000 people showing up. We had grown to that size. Last year there was like 250, right?
Which, let's phrase it right, it was a pivot into a hybrid event,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Yes.
well, we pivoted. It's funny that came off really well. We pivoted last minute. I
Yes.
mean, just decided, and the reasons are what they are. But
Right. And I'd give Scott a huge credit for the way that it was phrased to go. And just to show you the online is viable, that's how I'm going to be running that segment from home, just like you.
yeah,
And that's what planted that transparency that had to be there. And it was a great experience for online too.
yeah. And so, this year though, I think everyone is just burnt out on this pandemic, right? And I think the overall trend looks like more people are getting vaccinated. The winter spike is naturally abating some, and I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to get 1,000 people into Vegas again by the end of July. Now, I mean that may not happen. The plans right now are not to do a hybrid event. If things, if everything goes exactly wrong, there would be a chance that we might do another hybrid event, but that decision won't be made until June, right?
Yeah. Which I like that phrase of, oh, we know how to do this
Yeah,
if we have to. That's how this podcast series last year around the same time. That's why we suddenly went out twice a week to go, hey, let's highlight the people who are already doing a ton of work online to show, look, this is not new. We know how to do this. Here's how.
yeah.
No, but I've heard a lot of great feedback from people. I've had, we've got some other conversations in the podcast. Next week is Jim Wan, Dan Kendall, and Michael DeShalit, which, by the way, is the largest panel we've ever had on a single episode.
Yeah.
Yay! That's my little
I think
claim to
that's
fame on
great.
that.
They got
Yeah.
they got Dan and Michael, are putting on a 3-day pre-conference, and I think it's great that they got Jim to come out. Jim helped us a lot for a few years with the stage show, and he was a
Well, I
big
think this
supporter.
this goes back to what you mentioned with like the projects that I now do with Richard, or even a few years back. This is the environment where, and you can all find this on YouTube. I'm sure now that I've said it, the editors of this program will put it into the show notes because we just put it on YouTube to say, hey, everybody, here, Kevin Cole and I, just in a side conversation, go. I forget whose idea it was, his or mine, to go, what if we did a workshop at a hypnosis conference called Do Less Hypnosis?
Right?
And we just went, well, let's submit it and see if they want it. And then this is the questionable part. Then we'll figure out exactly what that is if they take it. And of course, you and Scott went, hey, that sounds good. Do it. Which we did a whole workshop for 2 hours on like conversational influence before and after the session. But it's become this. And I remember my first hypnothoughts, being called into a panel where talking about the methods of Dave Ellman, where of course Cheryl and Larry were there. I'm sitting between Sean Michael Andrews and Michael Elner. And going down the line, it was Teresa Van Zeller, it was Seth Deborah Roth, it was Roy Hunter, Michael Elner. I think I've said Michael twice there. But this environment of people.
He was twice the guy.
What's that?
He was twice. He was twice the guy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But this environment of people learning together, collaborating together, and creating something really, really unique. You hinted at something, I think, when we were first chatting before we jumped on about sort of the, as I'd phrase it, the superhero skill of being able to organize things where others couldn't, being able to make things happen. Can you expand on that?
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting, and this is how I said as an undegreed person, I got big jobs in corporate America doing engineering, right? Because I've got sort of an innate ability to visualize all the working components in a system and sort of spot where there might be problems and proactively work on that, right? So I'm really good at systems thinking, big picture thinking, and it's helped me a lot, in my therapy career, right? When someone comes in and they give me their presenting problem, I see it as a more holistic system that needs, okay, so this little piece over here might not seem like it's part of it, but if we change this little piece, everything else is going to run a lot more smoother, or not a lot more smoothly. So yeah, I mean that's just something that's sort of always been my forte, is to be able to problem solve and make systems work. So, and that's all a conference is, right? Is a giant system of moving components. So that's sort of, like I said, just fallen to me. I like, every year we switch things up a little to see, what's that going to do for our conference system. Like this year, we intentionally put a focus on having more 4-hour workshops, more 3-day workshops, 4-day workshops. So we're really looking at sort of providing more depth. I look at, a lot of people, they come to the conference and everyone is always like, oh, what do I want to see? What do I want to see? And they bounce back and forth, and you get a lot of little pieces. That's really helpful. That's to grab a technique here, a perspective there, an approach over here, learn something new about something you hadn't learned before. But I think this year is going to really, really benefit everyone, where they can say, oh, I've really wanted to, study this area more, and they can go for a 4-hour talk on it, as just part of the conference. And
yeah, which that was a great part of, of the conference, but also last year with HypnoThoughts Platinum. I do have to have one moment for me though. Richard, do we get the rights of claiming the first Richard Clark podcast recording?
Oh, absolutely.
Hell yeah.
It's funny. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I've told others. People ask me, and I say, "Oh, hell no! I can't even stand listening to podcasts." And that is one thing. I mean, it's not a short attention span, but again, just sort of the way the way I work, and even in my college career, in going to different trainings, most good speakers, they tell you, in the first 15, 30 minutes, really all about what they're going to teach you, right? Mm-hmm. And I have just this ability to sort of flesh that out, right? So once you've told me in 15 minutes everything you're going to tell me, I've already figured out, okay, so that would mean this, and that would mean that, and that would mean this, and that would mean that.
Well, you've given us some amazing insights and stories in 43 minutes, so thank you for that. Where can people find out more from you? How can they learn more about HypnoThoughts? Where's the best place to go for that?
htlive.net.
Awesome. And of course, we'll link to that in the show notes. You can check out some of the workshops before, during, and after. Richard, thank you for coming on. Any final thoughts for the listeners out there?
I think for final thoughts, I'd like to just sort of speak globally, and hope that everyone keeps an open mind about where things are going. I mean, the current world situation is tenuous. I'm a eternal optimist, so I feel like this year we're going to break out of a lot of this dreariness, and things are going to turn around. And just looking forward to seeing everyone in July and August.
Jason Linett here once again, and as always, thank you so much for interacting with this program. And I'll tell you, my favorite part of this is that it really helps to start a conversation with not just me, but also the people who are on the program. I mentioned a quick conversation I had with Anthony Serino, who was on a little while ago, who goes, hey, I just got another client from someone who heard me on your program. So really, again, building community, bringing us all together. And thank you once again to Richard for joining me for this episode. The first episode launched as I'm now living in another state. So head over to htlive.net to see all about the upcoming HypnoThoughts Live convention. And once again, check out hypnoticproducts.com. That's the 2-day post-conference training specifically about helping you to create, design, launch, and continuously profit from your own passive income machines. Richard beat me to my favorite catchphrase. Thank you, Ron Popeil, for this one. Set it and forget it. Though for a little bit more of an instant gratification, head over to jasonwebinar.com. That's an on-demand free presentation. 6 steps to build a 6-figure hypnosis income. Check that out, jasonwebinar.com. Hope to see you in Vegas. Stay safe. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks for listening to the Work Smart Hypnosis podcast at WorkSmartHypnosis.com.